Colorado Territory, 1876, a time when silver fever consumed men's souls and transformed family bonds into bitter rivalries over precious metal, when the promise of underground riches made human life expendable, and when pregnant women were seen as nothing more than burdens, slowing down the race to fortune. For twin sisters Clara and Rose Flanagan, their journey to the mining camps of Leadville represented hope for a future where their unborn children might know prosperity instead of poverty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But in a territory where silver outweighed blood, and where cave-ins could bury both secrets and witnesses forever, some discoveries were too valuable to share with anyone, especially two Irish women whose only crime was trusting the wrong men. With their lives, the letter that changed everything arrived at the overcrowded tenements of Boston's north. And on a frigid February morning in 1876, Clara Flanagan held the crinkled paper with trembling fingers, her sister Rose reading over her shoulder as both women struggled to believe the words that seemed too good to be true. "Come west, immediately," the letter read in their brother Patrick's familiar scrawl. "The Silver Bell mine outside Leadville needs camp cooks and laundresses. Pay is 4 times what you're earning in the factories. Send word by return post, and I'll arrange transport. There's room for families here, Clara. Your children could grow up with silver dust in their pockets instead of coal soot in their lungs." Clara absently placed a protective hand over her swollen belly, now 6 months heavy with child. Beside her, Rose did the same. The twin sisters sharing not only identical faces, but nearly identical circumstances. Both had been abandoned by the fathers of their unborn children. Both struggled to survive on seamstress wages that barely paid for a single room they shared in Mrs. Murphy's boarding house. 4 times the pay, Rose whispered, her green eyes bright with possibility. "Clara, we could actually provide for them, give our babies the life we never had." Clara studied the letter again, noting details that both excited and worried her. Patrick had been in Colorado Territory for 2 years, initially working as a miner before establishing himself as a labor coordinator for the Silver Bell mine. His letters had grown increasingly optimistic over recent months, describing opportunities that seemed almost fantastical to women accustomed to grinding poverty. "He says there's a shortage of women in the camps," Clara observed. "Miners pay premium wages for home cooking and clean clothes. We could earn enough in a year to buy our own place, maybe even start a boarding house." Rose's excitement was infectious, but Clara's natural caution, developed through years of caring for her more impulsive twin, made her consider potential dangers. "It's wilderness, Rose. No doctors, no hospitals. What if something goes wrong with the births?" "What if something goes wrong here?" Rose countered, gesturing toward their cramped quarters, where icy wind whistled through gaps in the walls. "At least in Colorado, our children would have a chance at something better." The decision seemed inevitable when Clara lost her position at the textile mill the following week. The foreman, citing her increasing inability to keep pace due to her pregnancy, dismissed her with barely a day's notice. With Rose's wages alone insufficient to sustain them both, Colorado Territory began to seem less like an adventure and more like their only viable option for survival. Within a month, they were aboard a westbound train, their few possessions packed into 2 battered trunks, and their hopes pinned entirely on Patrick's promises of prosperity in the mining camps of Leadville. The railroad journey from Boston to Denver took 5 grueling days, with the pregnant twins cramped into hard wooden seats that offered little comfort for their swollen bodies. And Clara, always the more practical sister, had insisted they travel in the cheapest accommodations to preserve their meager savings for establishing themselves in Colorado. "We'll need every penny when we arrive," she explained to Rose during their second night aboard the swaying train. Patrick mentioned that everything costs 3 times normal prices in the mining camps. Food, supplies, even basic clothing commands premium rates. Rose gazed out the window at the vast prairies rolling past in endless waves of brown grass and scattered settlements. It's so empty out here. Back home you can't travel an hour without seeing another city. This goes on forever. That the observation proved prophetic as their journey continued westward. At each stop, Chicago, Omaha, Cheyenne, the landscape grew more sparse and intimidating. Fellow passengers spoke in hushed tones about Indian troubles, bandit attacks, and the general lawlessness that characterized the frontier territories. A grizzled cattle rancher named Morrison, traveling with a herd bound for Colorado grazing. Lands took pity on the obviously pregnant twins and shared both advice and provisions. "Ladies," he said during a brief stop in Nebraska, "I don't mean to intrude, but Colorado territory ain't like Boston. Men outnumber women 30 to 1 in the mining camps. That brings opportunities but also dangers you might not anticipate." Clara appreciated his concern while bristling slightly at the implied criticism of their decision. "Our brother has arranged employment for us. We're not traveling blindly into unknown circumstances." "I'm sure your brother means well," Morrison replied diplomatically, "but mining camps change fast. Men who seemed trustworthy last month might turn desperate when silver prices drop or claims play out. Just be careful who you trust." The advice seemed reasonable enough, though Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Morrison was holding back more specific warnings. When she pressed him for details, he simply shook his head and returned to his own concerns. "Probably just frontier pessimism," Rose suggested when Clara shared her unease. "People out here seem to expect the worst from everyone." From Denver, they continued by stagecoach toward Leadville, a journey that tested every assumption they'd held about travel discomfort. The primitive roads carved through mountain passes that seemed to scrape the sky itself, while bitter wind and occasional spring snow reminded them how far they'd traveled from the familiar climate of New England. Clara's pregnancy, now 7 months advanced, made the jarring coach ride nearly unbearable. Every bump and jolt sent pain shooting through her back and sides, while the thin mountain air left her constantly breathless. Rose fared little better, her own pregnancy having progressed to a similar stage. "How much farther?" Rose asked weakly, during one particularly brutal stretch of road that climbed through a rocky pass between snow-capped peaks. The stagecoach driver, a leathery man named Hawkins, who seemed immune to both weather and terrain, consulted landmarks visible through the swirling clouds. "Leadville's maybe 6 hours ahead, assuming we don't hit delays. But you ladies aren't going all the way to town, are you? Your brother's letter said Silver Bell Mine Camp." Clara nodded, feeling a fresh wave of anxiety about their destination. The mining camp lay another hour beyond Leadville proper, further into the wilderness and farther from any semblance of civilization. "Silver Bell's a good operation," Hawkins continued, apparently trying to reassure them. "Steady production, fair treatment of workers. Your brother Patrick's well regarded there. Built himself a solid reputation as someone who can organize labor, crews, and keep operations running smooth." The reassurance helped ease Clara's concerns, until Hawkins added, almost as an afterthought, "Course, mining camps can turn ugly fast when claims start playing out or when outside interests move in. Competition for silver rights gets fierce around Leadville." Again, Clara sensed undercurrents of warning that no one seemed willing to articulate directly. Were they traveling into danger that locals understood but wouldn't explicitly state? Or was frontier life simply filled with so many potential hazards that worry became a constant companion? Their first glimpse of Silver Bell Mine Camp came at sunset, when the western mountains cast long shadows across a collection of wooden buildings scattered along the sides of a narrow valley. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, while the rhythmic thudding of machinery suggested continuous mining operations, even during evening hours. Patrick was waiting at the camp's main supply depot when their stagecoach arrived, his face weathered by 2 years of mountain sun and wind, but his smile genuinely welcoming. The brother they remembered from Boston had been transformed by frontier life into someone leaner, harder, but apparently more prosperous than they'd ever known him. "Clara! Rose!" he called out, rushing to help them from the coach as other miners and camp workers gathered to observe the arrival of new women. "You made it! And look at you both. When are the babies due?" "August," Clara replied, accepting his assistance while noting how the assembled crowd studied them with obvious interest. "Rose is maybe 2 weeks behind me." Patrick's expression showed brief concern at their advanced pregnancies, but he quickly covered it with enthusiasm about their arrival. Perfect timing. The camp's been desperate for decent cooks and laundresses. Mrs. Henderson, who's been handling those duties, is moving on to Denver next week. You'll have steady work immediately. As Patrick led them toward a small cabin that would serve as their quarters, Clara observed details that both impressed and worried her. The mining camp was larger and more organized than she'd anticipated, with perhaps 200 men employed in various capacities, but the ratio of men to women was even more extreme than Morrison had suggested. She counted perhaps a dozen women among the entire population. "How many families live here?" Rose asked, apparently making similar observations. 15 or 20, Patrick replied. "Most of the married men leave their wives in Denver or Colorado Springs. Too isolated here for family life, they claim." Clara noted the qualification in his phrasing. "But some families do stay?" "The ones with reasons to remain close to the mining operations," Patrick explained somewhat evasively. "Mine supervisors, equipment specialists, folks whose work requires constant presence." Their cabin proved comfortable but basic. 2 small rooms with a cooking area and sleeping space for both sisters. Patrick had furnished it with essentials purchased from the camp store, though everything bore the premium prices he'd warned them about in his letters. "Tomorrow, I'll introduce you to the camp supervisors," Patrick continued as they settled into their new quarters. "Foreman Hutchins runs daily operations. Mr. Caldwell handles business affairs for the mine owners back in Denver. And there's Dr. Brennan, though he's not a medical doctor. He's a mining engineer who oversees safety protocols." Clara's heart sank at the lack of medical facilities. "No actual doctor? What happens if someone gets injured or when our babies come?" Patrick's expression grew uncomfortable. "Nearest doctor is in Leadville. Dr. Maxwell makes rounds to the camps when he can, but emergencies, well, we handle them as best we can." The reality of their situation began settling over Clara with uncomfortable weight. They were now hundreds of miles from proper medical care, surrounded by men they didn't know, dependent entirely on Patrick's position in the camp hierarchy for their security and livelihood. "It'll be fine," Rose said, either sensing Clara's anxiety or fighting her own. "Women have been having babies without doctors for thousands of years. We'll manage." Patrick nodded eagerly, clearly preferring optimism to dwelling on potential problems. "Absolutely. And you'll both earn good wages here. Camp pays top dollar for quality services." Clara and Rose settled into camp life with surprising ease over their first few weeks at Silver Bell Mine. Their cooking quickly earned praise from miners tired of bland, poorly prepared meals, while their laundry services proved equally popular. The financial prospects Patrick had promised materialized rapidly. Within a month, they had earned more than 6 months of factory wages back in Boston. But Clara's natural caution kept her alert to subtle tensions that seemed to permeate the camp's atmosphere. Conversations stopped when she approached certain groups of men. Business discussions took place behind closed doors. And most troubling, Patrick himself seemed increasingly nervous about topics he'd previously discussed openly. "How's the silver production been lately?" Clara asked during one of their evening conversations. "You used to write about how rich the ore veins were proving." Patrick glanced around their cabin as if checking for eavesdroppers before answering. "Production's changing. The original claims have been steady, but there's been some reorganization of mining rights recently." The evasive answer triggered Clara's instincts developed through years of reading between the lines of Patrick's correspondence. "What kind of reorganization?" "Outside investors have been buying up claims from individual miners," Patrick explained reluctantly. "Consolidating operations under larger corporate management. It's probably more efficient in the long run." Rose looked up from the mending she was working on. "That sounds positive. Better organization usually means better pay and working conditions." Patrick's expression suggested the situation was more complicated than Rose's optimistic interpretation. "Sometimes, but it also means decisions get made by people who don't live in the camps, don't understand local conditions." Clara pressed for more specific information. "Have these changes affected your position here?" "Not yet," Patrick replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "Labor coordination is still needed regardless of who owns the claims, but there have been adjustments to how things operate." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at their cabin door. Patrick answered to find Foreman Hutchins, a burly man in his 40s whose authority in the camp seemed second only to the absent mine owners. "Evening, Patrick," Hutchins said, nodding politely to Clara and Rose. "Sorry to disturb, but we need to discuss tomorrow's work assignments, some changes in the mining schedule." Patrick stepped outside for the discussion, but Clara could hear fragments through the thin cabin walls. Words like restricted access and need-to-know basis suggested the mining operations were becoming more secretive. When Patrick returned, his expression was troubled. "What did he want?" Clara asked directly. "Just routine scheduling," Patrick replied, but his obvious discomfort contradicted the casual explanation. Clara decided to approach the situation more directly. "Patrick, is something wrong here? You seem worried about things you won't discuss with us." Her brother sat heavily in one of the cabin's 2 chairs, suddenly looking older than his 28 years. "It's probably nothing, just politics. Between the old-time miners and the new corporate interests. Sometimes there's friction when ownership changes hands." "What kind of friction?" Rose asked, setting aside her mending with growing concern. Patrick was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Some of the original miners aren't happy about losing their claims to outside investors. They feel like they're being pushed out. After doing all the dangerous work of establishing the mines." Clara sensed there was more to the story. "And how does that affect us?" "It doesn't," Patrick said quickly. "Camp services like cooking and laundry are needed regardless of who owns the mines. You're both safe here." But something in his tone suggested Patrick was trying to convince himself as much as his sisters. The first direct evidence that something was seriously wrong came 3 weeks later, when Clara accidentally overheard a heated conversation between Foreman Hutchins and 2 men she didn't recognize, well-dressed strangers who clearly weren't miners. Clara had been returning from the camp store when she heard raised voices coming from behind the equipment storage shed. Her pregnancy made walking difficult, so she had paused to rest when the argument began. "The original miners are asking too many questions," one of the strangers was saying, "especially the Irish ones. They remember what the ore samples looked like before we consolidated the claims." Hutchins's voice carried a defensive tone. "I can't control what people remember, but the current operations are producing adequately for your investors." "Adequately isn't sufficient," the second stranger replied coldly. The reports we're sending back east indicate much higher silver content than what's actually being extracted. If anyone starts comparing old production records with current output. Clara's blood chilled as she realized she was overhearing evidence of mining fraud. The corporate investors were apparently falsifying production reports while stealing silver that rightfully belonged to the original claim holders. "What about the labor coordinator?" the first stranger asked. "Patrick Flanagan seems popular with the workers. Could he become a problem?" "Patrick's loyal," Hutchins replied, though his voice lacked certainty. "He understands that cooperation benefits everyone." And his sisters. They've been asking questions around camp. Miners talk to them while they're cooking and doing laundry. Clara's heart began racing as she realized she and Rose had become subjects of discussion among the conspirators. "The sisters are due to give birth soon," Hutchins pointed out. "They'll be too occupied with babies to pay attention to mining operations." "Perhaps," the second stranger said skeptically, "but pregnant women are complications we don't need, especially ones with connections to workers who might remember inconvenient details about previous ore quality." The conversation continued for several more minutes, but Clara had heard enough to understand their danger. She and Rose weren't just innocent camp workers. They were potential witnesses to mining fraud, and their presence was considered a liability by powerful men with criminal motives. Clara returned to their cabin with her mind racing, trying to decide how much to share with Rose and Patrick. Her sister's pregnancy had become increasingly difficult, with frequent pain and obvious exhaustion. Adding fear and stress to Rose's condition could trigger premature labor, but keeping the information secret might be even more dangerous if the conspirators decided to eliminate potential threats. Clara's opportunity to warn Patrick came the following evening, when Rose retired. Early with back pain that seemed to be intensifying, Clara found her brother checking equipment in the camp's machinery shed, apparently working late to avoid conversations with other camp personnel. "Patrick," she said quietly, "we need to talk privately about the mine operations." Her brother looked up from the equipment he'd been inspecting, his expression immediately wary. "What about them?" Clara told him about the conversation she'd overheard, watching as Patrick's face grew increasingly pale with each detail she recounted. "You're certain they mentioned our names specifically?" he asked when she finished. "They called you the labor coordinator and referred to his sisters. They're worried we might learn too much about what they're really doing here." Patrick sat heavily on a crate of mining supplies, suddenly looking defeated. "I was afraid something like this might happen." "You knew about the fraud?" Clara asked, shocked by his admission. "I suspected," Patrick corrected. "Production numbers haven't matched what I was seeing come out of the mines. But I hoped, it was just accounting irregularities, not deliberate theft." Clara felt a surge of anger at her brother's willful blindness. "So you brought us into a dangerous situation without warning us." "I brought you here because you were starving in Boston," Patrick shot back defensively. "At least here you had a chance to earn decent money before the babies came." "Money stolen from the rightful mine owners," Clara pointed out coldly. Patrick's shoulders sagged. "I know. But what choice did I have? Turn you away when you needed help? Report suspicions? I couldn't prove and lose my position?" Clara understood the impossible position Patrick had faced, but that didn't diminish their current danger. "What do we do now?" "We leave," Patrick said immediately. "Tonight, if possible. Take what we can carry and get to Leadville before they realize we're gone." Clara's heart sank as she considered the practical obstacles to immediate departure. "Rose can barely walk, Patrick. The baby's due any day. Traveling rough mountain roads in her condition could kill both her and the child. Staying here might kill all of us," Patrick replied grimly. "If those men decide we're too dangerous to leave alive—" The conversation was interrupted by the sound of heavy boots approaching the shed. Patrick quickly motioned for Clara to hide. behind a stack of equipment cases, as Foreman Hutchins appeared in the doorway. "Working late, Patrick?" Hutchins observed, his tone carrying subtle suspicion. "Just checking the equipment rotation schedule," Patrick replied with forced casualness. "Tomorrow's shift assignments." Hutchins stepped further into the shed, his eyes scanning the space as if looking for something or someone. "Thought I heard voices. Just talking to myself," Patrick explained. "Bad habit when you're working alone." Clara held her breath, pressed against the cold metal of the equipment cases, while Hutchins continued his inspection of the shed. If he discovered her presence, their conversation about escape plans would be revealed immediately. "Mr. Caldwell wants to see you in his office," Hutchins finally said. "Something about adjusting your work schedule." Patrick nodded, though Clara could see tension in his posture. "I'll head over there now." As the two men left the shed, Clara remained hidden until she was certain they were gone. Then she crept back to the cabin, her mind racing with the implications of the unexpected summons. Were the conspirators already moving against Patrick? Had they somehow learned about her eavesdropping? Rose was awake when Clara entered their cabin, sitting up in bed with obvious discomfort. "Where were you?" Rose asked. "I woke up and you were gone." Clara quickly explained the situation, watching as her sister's expression shifted from confusion to fear to grim determination. "We have to leave," Rose said immediately, struggling to stand despite her obvious pain. "Whatever the risks of traveling, they're less than staying here." Clara helped her sister to her feet, noting with alarm how Rose's face contorted with what appeared to be labor pains. "Rose, I think the baby might be coming." Rose gripped Clara's arm tightly as another wave of pain passed through her. "Then we need to leave even more urgently. I won't give birth in a place where our children might not survive to see their first birthdays." As if summoned by their conversation, Patrick appeared at the cabin door, his face grim with confirmation of their worst fears. "We're leaving now," he announced. Caldwell's meeting was a trap. They're planning to eliminate anyone who might threaten their operation. That includes all three of us. Clara felt the weight of their desperate situation settling over her like a physical burden. They were trapped in a remote mining camp controlled by dangerous criminals, with Rose going into labor and no safe means of escape. But they had no choice, except to try. "How?" Rose gasped between contractions. "The roads are watched. They'll catch us before we reach Leadville." Patrick's expression was grim but determined. "Not the roads, the mine tunnels. There's an old access shaft that connects to the original workings. It comes out about 3 miles from here, near an abandoned claim. From there we can circle around to reach Leadville without using the main trail." Clara stared at her brother in horror. "You want us to escape through active mine tunnels, with Rose in labor?" "It's our only chance," Patrick insisted. "The conspirators expect us to try the roads. They'll never think to watch the old mine workings." Rose doubled over with another contraction, but when it passed, her voice was steady with resolve. "We do it, whatever the risks." Clara looked between her laboring sister and her desperate brother, understanding that their choices had narrowed to a single, terrifying option. They would escape through the dark maze of silver mine tunnels, or they would die trying. Either way, their time at Silver Bell mine camp was over. The entrance to the abandoned mine shaft lay hidden behind a massive boulder formation, 200 yards from the main camp operations. Patrick had discovered it during his first months at Silver Bell, when exploration of the original workings revealed a network of tunnels that predated the corporate consolidation by nearly a decade. The old-timers who dug these shafts followed silver veins wherever they led, Patrick explained in hushed tones as he helped Rose navigate the rocky terrain. "Some tunnels go for miles underground, connecting claims that were worked separately on the surface." Clara supported her sister's other arm, feeling each contraction that rippled through Rose's body with increasing frequency and intensity. The labor was progressing rapidly, too rapidly for comfort, given their desperate circumstances. "How long through the tunnels?" Clara asked, trying to calculate whether they could reach safety before Rose's baby arrived. Patrick consulted a crude map he'd sketched during previous explorations. 4 hours to the old McKenna claim if the passages are clear. From there, another 2 hours overland to reach Leadville. Rose paused as another contraction gripped her, gripping both her siblings' arms with surprising strength. When the pain passed, she looked directly at Patrick with fierce determination. "Then we don't have time to waste discussing difficulties. Show us the way." The entrance to the shaft was barely wide enough for a single person, hidden behind loose rocks that Patrick quickly moved aside. Beyond lay a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the faint starlight filtering down from above. Patrick lit a miner's lantern he'd retrieved from his equipment cache, revealing rough-hewn stone walls that disappeared into blackness ahead. The air smelled of mineral deposits, old timber and something else, a mustiness that suggested these passages had been abandoned for good reason. "Stay close," Patrick warned as they began their descent into the mine. "Some of these shafts have unstable supports, others flood during heavy rains, and there are places where the tunnels branch in multiple directions. It's easy to get lost if you don't know the way." Clara helped Rose carefully down the initial slope, noting how her sister's breathing had become labored from both physical exertion and the onset of advanced labor. The timing couldn't have been worse, but they had no choice except to continue. Forward. The tunnel leveled out after 50 yards, opening into a wider chamber where multiple passages branched off in different directions. Patrick consulted his map again, choosing the leftmost passage after studying several tunnel mouths that looked identical to Clara's untrained eyes. "This one follows the original Silver Bell vein," he explained, leading them into a passage barely tall enough for Clara to walk upright. It should connect with the main transport tunnel about half a mile ahead. They had traveled perhaps a quarter mile through the winding passage when Rose suddenly stopped, doubling over with a contraction more intense than any previously. This time, when the pain passed, she remained bent forward, breathing heavily. "The contractions are getting closer together," she gasped. "Maybe 3 minutes apart now." Clara felt her heart sink. Advanced labor meant Rose's baby could arrive within hours, possibly before they could reach safety. Giving birth in an abandoned tunnel without medical assistance or proper supplies could prove fatal for both mother and child. "Can you continue?" Patrick asked gently, though his expression showed he understood the gravity of their situation. Rose straightened with visible effort, her face pale but determined in the lantern light. "I can continue. The question is whether we'll make it to safety before the baby decides to arrive." They resumed their underground journey, but Clara noticed Rose's pace becoming increasingly labored. Each contraction now required a complete stop, with Rose gripping the tunnel walls until the pain passed. What had initially been a 4-hour journey was stretching toward much longer as they were forced to pause every few minutes. The tunnel began to slope downward more steeply, and Clara realized they were descending deeper into the mountain than Patrick had initially indicated. Worse, the air was becoming noticeably thinner and more difficult to breathe. "Patrick," Clara said quietly during one of Rose's contractions, "how deep do these tunnels go?" Her brother's hesitation before answering told Clara more than his words. "The main transport level is about 200 feet below the surface. Some of the deeper workings go down another 100 feet from there." Clara understood the implications immediately. If something went wrong, if the tunnels collapsed or flooded, they would be trapped hundreds of feet underground with no possibility of rescue. And rescue might not come anyway if the conspirators believed they had simply fled into the wilderness. "There's something else," Patrick continued reluctantly. "The deeper tunnels sometimes fill with gases from the mining operations, mostly harmless, but they can make breathing difficult. As if summoned by his warning, Clara began to notice a strange smell in the air, something metallic and slightly sweet that made her feel lightheaded. Rose was clearly affected as well, her breathing becoming even more labored. "How much farther to the main tunnel?" Clara asked, fighting a growing sense of panic. Patrick consulted his map again, though Clara suspected he was buying time rather than actually checking their location. "Maybe half a mile more. Once we reach the transport level, the air should be clearer." But even as he spoke, the passage ahead seemed to narrow, and Clara could hear sounds that definitely hadn't been present when they started. A distant rumbling that could be either underground water or active mining operations. When they finally reached the main transport tunnel, Clara's relief was immediately tempered by new concerns. The passage was indeed larger and better ventilated, but it showed clear signs of recent use. Fresh wheel ruts in the dirt floor and newly placed timber supports suggested this wasn't as abandoned as Patrick had believed. "They're still using these tunnels," Rose observed between contractions, having noticed the same evidence. Patrick studied the signs of recent activity with obvious worry. "This complicates things. If they're moving equipment through here, we might encounter work crews." Clara realized their situation had shifted from dangerous to potentially catastrophic. If the conspirators discovered them in the tunnels, there would be no escape and no witnesses to whatever happened next. "Can we find another route?" she asked. Patrick shook his head grimly. "This is the only passage that connects to the McKenna. Claim exit. All the other tunnels either dead-end or circle back to the main camp." Rose straightened from her latest contraction with renewed determination. "Then we go forward. Standing here debating won't solve anything." They began following the transport tunnel deeper into the mountain, with Patrick keeping the lantern light as dim as possible to avoid detection while still providing enough illumination to navigate safely. The passage stretched ahead in a straight line, disappearing beyond their light's reach. After 20 minutes of careful progress, they heard the first sounds of human activity ahead, voices echoing off tunnel walls, accompanied by the scraping of tools against stone. Patrick immediately extinguished the lantern, plunging them into absolute darkness. "Work crew," he whispered. "They're probably loading ore cars for transport to the surface." Clara felt Rose grip her arm tightly as another contraction began, but her sister managed to remain silent despite the obvious pain. In the darkness, every sound seemed amplified, their breathing, the shuffle of their feet, and most concerning, the voices ahead that seemed to be getting closer. "We need to hide," Patrick whispered, feeling along the tunnel walls for any alcove or side passage that might provide concealment. Clara helped guide Rose toward what felt like a shallow recess in the tunnel wall, pressing back into the shadows as footsteps and voices approached their position. Through the darkness, she could see the flickering glow of lanterns moving in their direction. "Told Hutchins we'd have this section cleared by morning," one voice was saying. "If we don't make quota, he'll dock our pay again." "Hutchins can. He'll dock whatever he wants," another voice replied bitterly. "Man's been skimming crew wages since the new owners took over, probably pocketing half what we're supposed to earn." The voices and lights passed within yards of their hiding place, continuing deeper into the tunnel system. Clara held her breath until the sounds faded completely, then helped Patrick relight their lantern. "They're working the night shift," Patrick realized, "which means this tunnel will be active until dawn." Rose was breathing heavily, both from the stress of hiding and from her advancing labor. "How long until dawn?" she managed to ask. Patrick checked his pocket watch. "About 4 hours." Clara felt their options narrowing to an impossible choice. They couldn't remain hidden in the tunnel for 4 hours with Rose in active labor. But continuing forward meant risking encounter with more work crews who would certainly report their presence to the conspirators. "Is there any other way out of these tunnels?" Clara asked desperately. Patrick was quiet for a long moment before answering. "There might be," but it's dangerous. Patrick's alternative route led through what he called the old deep workings, a network of tunnels that had been abandoned when water seepage made them unsafe for regular mining operations. The passages lay 50 feet below their current level, accessible through a series of narrow shafts that connected the different tunnel systems. The water problem was never completely solved, Patrick explained as he led them to a shaft opening that descended into darkness. During heavy rains, the lower tunnels can flood completely, and the timber supports down there are old, some installed 20 years ago. Clara peered down the shaft, seeing only darkness beyond their lanterns' reach. "How do we know the tunnels aren't flooded now?" "We don't," Patrick admitted, "but it's been dry for the past month. The water level should be at its lowest point." Rose was leaning heavily against the tunnel wall, her contractions now coming every 2 minutes with increasing intensity. She looked up from her latest ordeal with a mixture of pain and determination. "I can't climb down a shaft in this condition," she said honestly. "And even if I could, what happens when the baby starts coming while we're underground?" Clara understood her sister's concerns, but their alternatives were rapidly disappearing. The transport tunnel remained active with work crews. Going back meant facing the conspirators who were probably already searching for them. And staying in place meant Rose would give birth in an active mine with no medical assistance. "There might be another option," Patrick said hesitantly. "The old workings connect to a natural cave system. If we can reach the caves, there are multiple exits to the surface, some of them miles from the mining camp." Clara studied her brother's expression, recognizing the signs that he was withholding important information. "What aren't you telling us?" Patrick was quiet for a moment before answering. "The cave system is partly on Kiowa territory. The tribe considers it sacred ground. If we're caught there by a war party..." The implication hung in the air between them. Death at the hands of a Kiowa war party might be quicker than whatever the conspirators had planned, but it would be equally final. Rose pushed herself away from the tunnel wall with obvious effort. "Right now, I'm more worried about giving birth in a mine tunnel than about theoretical dangers from Indians we might never encounter." Clara realized her sister was right. They needed to focus on immediate survival rather than potential future threats. "How do we get down to the lower level?" she asked. Patrick showed them a crude rope and pulley system that miners had used to transport equipment between tunnel levels. The ropes were old, but appeared serviceable, and the pulleys were secured to heavy timber frames that seemed solid. "I'll go down first and test the passages," Patrick offered. "If the tunnels are clear, I'll signal for you to follow." Clara shook her head. "We stay together. If something happens to you down there, Rose and I would be trapped up here with no way out." Rose agreed, despite her obvious discomfort. "Whatever we do together." The descent to the lower tunnels proved even more harrowing than Clara had anticipated. The rope system, designed for equipment rather than people, required them to lower themselves hand over hand while trying to control their descent speed. For Rose, heavily pregnant and in active labor, the physical demands were nearly impossible. "I can't do this," Rose gasped after attempting to grip the rope during a contraction. "My hands won't hold." Clara and Patrick quickly improvised a harness, using rope and their clothing, creating a sling that would support Rose's weight during the descent. The arrangement was crude but functional, allowing them to lower Rose gradually while Patrick descended ahead to guide her path. When they finally reached the lower tunnel level, Clara was shocked by the difference in conditions. The air was noticeably cooler and damper, with a metallic smell that suggested the presence of standing water. Worse, the tunnel supports were visibly deteriorating. Timber beams sagged under their loads, and several showed obvious signs of rot. "These supports won't hold much longer," Clara observed, noting how their footsteps seemed to echo differently in the unstable passages. Patrick nodded grimly. which is why these tunnels were abandoned. But if we're careful and move quickly, we should be able to reach the cave system before anything collapses. Rose was now having contractions every 90 seconds, each one more intense than the last. Clara could see exhaustion replacing determination in her sister's expression, and she realized they were racing against time in multiple ways, not just to escape their pursuers, but to find safety before Rose's baby arrived. "How much farther to the caves?" Clara asked, as they began moving through passages that seemed to grow narrower and more unstable with each step. Patrick consulted his map, though Clara suspected he was estimating rather than following precise directions. Maybe half a mile. The connection should be just ahead, but as they continued forward, the sounds of their passage seemed to trigger responses from the tunnel structure itself. Timber beams creaked ominously overhead, and occasionally small showers of dirt and rock fell from the ceiling. Most concerning, Clara began to hear the sound of running water somewhere ahead, a sound that grew louder as they progressed. "Patrick," she said quietly, "I think there's water in the tunnels ahead." Her brother paused to listen, his expression growing grave as he recognized the implications. "The spring runoff. I didn't calculate for snowmelt from the high country." Clara realized they were walking into a potential death trap. Flooded tunnels would be impassable, especially for Rose in her current condition. But the sounds of water were definitely getting louder, suggesting significant flooding ahead. "Can we go back?" Rose asked between contractions. Though her voice suggested she already knew the answer, Patrick shook his head. "The work crews are still active in the upper tunnels, and even if we avoided them, we'd still face the same problems that brought us down here." Clara felt their options narrowing to a single terrifying choice: continue forward into potentially flooded tunnels or remain trapped in unstable passages with Rose about to give birth. When they finally reached the connection to the natural cave system, Clara's relief was immediately tempered by new concerns. The passage that should have led to the caves was partially blocked by a rockfall, leaving an opening barely large enough for a single person to squeeze through. Beyond the opening, Clara could hear the echo of running water and the distinctive acoustics that suggested a large underground space. But she could also hear something else, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from the mountain itself. "The caves are definitely there," Patrick said, examining the rockfall. "But this passage is much smaller than it should be. Something's shifted in the rock formations." Rose was leaning against the tunnel wall, breathing heavily between contractions that were now coming almost continuously. "I can't fit through that opening," she admitted. "Not in my condition." Clara studied the blocked passage, trying to calculate whether they could widen it enough for Rose to pass through. The rocks looked loose enough to move, but disturbing. They might trigger a larger collapse. "We have to try," Clara decided. "It's our only way forward." Working together, she and Patrick began carefully removing stones from the rockfall, trying to enlarge the opening without destabilizing the remaining structure. Each stone they moved seemed to shift the balance of the pile, threatening to bring down larger rocks. As they worked, the rumbling sound grew louder, and Clara realized with growing alarm that it wasn't coming from the mountain's natural settling. It was the sound of heavy machinery operating somewhere above them. "They're blasting," Patrick suddenly realized. "The night shift must be opening new tunnel sections." Clara felt her blood turn cold as she understood the implications. Blasting operations could destabilize already weakened tunnel supports, triggering the exact kind of collapse that had made these passages unsafe in the first place. "We need to get out of here immediately," she said, redoubling her efforts to clear the passage. But even as she spoke, a tremendous explosion echoed through the tunnel system, followed by the grinding sound of timber supports giving way somewhere behind them. Dust filled the air, and small rocks began falling from the ceiling with increasing frequency. Rose looked up from her latest contraction with fear replacing determination in her eyes. The tunnels are collapsing. Patrick grabbed their lantern and the supplies they could carry, motioning frantically toward the partially cleared opening. Through the passage now, whatever it takes. Clara helped Rose toward the opening, realizing they were about to attempt something that could kill them all, squeezing through an unstable passage while the tunnel system collapsed around them, with Rose in the final stages of labor, and no idea what waited beyond in the cave system. But as another explosion shook the mountain and more tunnel supports began to fail, Clara understood they had no choice. They pushed through the narrow opening into the darkness beyond, leaving the collapsing mine tunnels behind and entering the unknown dangers of the underground cave system. Behind them, the passage they had just escaped filled with debris, as the tunnel system they had traveled through for hours ceased to exist, sealing their only route back to the surface and ensuring that whatever happened next, there would be no retreat. The cave system beyond the collapsed mine tunnels opened into a vast underground cathedral that defied Clara's understanding of natural formations. Their single lantern barely illuminated the soaring ceiling that disappeared into darkness above, while the sound of their footsteps echoed endlessly through passages that seemed to branch in all directions. Ancient rock formations created pillars and arches that appeared almost deliberately crafted, covered in mineral deposits that gleamed like jewels in the flickering light. But most striking were the painted symbols that decorated portions of the cave walls, geometric patterns and animal figures that spoke of human presence spanning generations. "We're in sacred ground," Patrick whispered, his voice carrying a reverence. That surprised Clara. The Kiowa have been using these caves for ceremonies longer than anyone can remember. Rose collapsed against one of the natural stone pillars, her body racked by contractions that now came without pause. "Sacred or not," she gasped, "this baby is coming now." Clara knelt beside her sister, using the lantern light to assess Rose's condition. What she saw filled her with both relief and terror. The birth was indeed imminent, but they were hundreds of feet underground with no medical supplies, no clean water, and no knowledge of how to find their way back to the surface. "Patrick, we need supplies," Clara said urgently. "Something clean for the baby, water if you can find it, anything that might help." Her brother nodded and began exploring the immediate area, his lantern light revealing details that were both beautiful and ominous. The cave paintings weren't just decorative. They told stories of ceremonies, hunts, and spiritual journeys that connected the underground chambers to the world above. "There's water," Patrick called from deeper in the chamber. "A spring that looks clean and—" His voice trailed off in obvious surprise. "What?" Clara demanded, unable to leave Rose's side. "Someone's been here recently. There are fresh ashes from a fire and what looks like ceremonial offerings." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's cool temperature. If the Kiowa still used these chambers for ceremonies, their presence here would be seen as a severe violation of sacred space. And if a war party discovered them, Rose's scream echoed through the vast chamber as another contraction gripped her, the sound seeming to awaken the very stones around them. Clara had assisted at enough births in Boston's tenements to recognize the signs. Rose's baby would arrive within the hour, regardless of their circumstances. "The birth is happening," Clara announced. "We need to prepare as best we can." 3 miles deeper in the cave system, Running Bear had been fasting for 4 days in preparation for his vision quest. The young Kiowa warrior had entered the sacred caves seeking guidance from the spirits about his tribe's future, following traditions passed down through countless generations. At 19, Running Bear was expected to receive a vision that would determine his role in the tribe's leadership. The recent encroachment of white miners and settlers had created divisions among the Kiowa about how to respond to the growing threats to their traditional lands. His grandfather, Chief Stonewolf, favored negotiation and careful diplomacy. The war chief, Iron Hand, advocated for direct military action to drive out the invaders. Running Bear's vision would help determine which path the spirits favored for their people's survival. But the sounds now echoing through the sacred chambers were unlike anything described in the traditional stories. Human voices, filled with pain and desperation, calling out in the white man's language from the direction of the painted chambers. Running Bear's first instinct was to investigate what might be hunters or miners who had somehow penetrated the sacred caves. His second thought was that the spirits themselves might be testing him by presenting a situation that would reveal his true character. Either way, the sounds demanded investigation. Moving silently through passages he had known since childhood, Running Bear approached the source of the voices. What he discovered challenged every assumption he had formed about the nature of his vision quest. Clara had managed to create a crude birthing area using their few possessions and materials. Patrick had gathered from around the cave clean water from the underground spring, strips of cloth torn from their clothing, and a relatively flat area of stone covered by their coats provided the most basic necessities. Rose was now in the final stages of labor, her cries echoing through the chamber with increasing frequency and intensity. Clara tried to remember everything she had learned from assisting at births in Boston, but the current circumstances were far beyond anything she had previously experienced. "I can see the baby's head," Clara announced, feeling a mixture of excitement and terror. "Rose, you need to push now." Her sister bore down with tremendous effort, her face contorted with pain and determination. The baby's head emerged slowly, followed by shoulders that seemed impossibly large for the narrow passage they had to navigate. "Almost there," Clara encouraged, supporting the baby's head while trying to ease the shoulders through. "One more. Push should do it." Rose gathered her remaining strength for a final tremendous effort, and suddenly the baby slipped free into Clara's waiting hands, a small, perfect girl who immediately began crying with healthy lungs that echoed through the vast chamber. "She's beautiful," Clara whispered, cleaning the baby's face and wrapping her in the cleanest cloth they had available. "Rose, you have a daughter." Rose collapsed back against the stone pillar, exhausted but smiling as Clara placed the crying infant in her arms. Despite the impossible circumstances, the birth had proceeded without major complications, and both mother and child appeared healthy. But their relief was immediately tempered by the reality of their situation. They were trapped underground with a newborn baby, no safe way to the surface, and no certainty that anyone would ever find them. "What do we do now?" Patrick asked quietly, voicing the question that Clara had been trying not to consider. Before anyone could answer, a new voice spoke from the darkness beyond their lantern light, words in a language none of them understood, spoken by someone who had been watching their struggle from the shadows. Running Bear stepped into the circle of lantern light, his appearance causing all three siblings to freeze in shock. The young Kiowa warrior stood tall and lean, wearing traditional buckskins decorated with intricate beadwork, his long black hair braided with feathers and small animal bones that marked his status as a vision seeker. His face showed no immediate hostility, but his hand rested on the handle of a knife at his belt as he assessed the strangers who had violated sacred ground. When his eyes fell on Rose, holding her newborn daughter, something in his expression shifted from wariness to something approaching wonder. Clara instinctively moved to shield her sister and the baby, while Patrick stepped forward with his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We mean no harm," Patrick said carefully, hoping the warrior understood English. "We're seeking shelter from dangerous men. We didn't know these caves were sacred." Running Bear studied them for a long moment before responding in accented but clear English. You bring new life into the sacred chambers." His voice carried a mixture of awe and concern. The spirits have never allowed such a thing before. Clara realized they might have inadvertently created a spiritual crisis for the young warrior. "We had no choice. The baby was coming, and the mine tunnels collapsed behind us. We're trapped." Here, Running Bear's expression grew more complex as he processed this information. According to tribal tradition, the presence of outsiders in the sacred caves should be met with immediate expulsion or worse. But the birth of a child in the most sacred chamber was something unprecedented, potentially either a terrible violation or a powerful spiritual sign. "Why are dangerous men pursuing you?" he asked, his hand still resting on his knife, but his posture less threatening. Patrick quickly explained about the mining fraud, their discovery of the conspiracy, and their desperate escape through the tunnels. As he spoke, Running Bear's expression darkened with recognition of familiar patterns. "The white men steal from each other as they steal from the earth," Running Bear observed. "They destroy sacred places for metal that brings only greed and suffering." Clara sensed an opportunity to connect with the warrior on shared grievances. "These men would kill us to protect their crimes. We're not their allies, we're their victims." Running Bear was quiet for several minutes, apparently wrestling with spiritual and practical considerations that Clara couldn't fully understand. Finally, he spoke with the weight of a decision that would affect them all. "The spirits have brought new life into the sacred chambers during my vision quest. This cannot be coincidence." He paused, studying the baby who had settled into peaceful sleep in Rose's arms. "I must seek guidance from my grandfather, but first you need safety from immediate danger." Running Bear led them deeper into the cave system, following passages that seemed to have been used for generations. Ancient fire. Rings marked ceremonial sites, while painted symbols on the walls told stories that Clara wished she could understand. "These caves extend for many miles," Running Bear explained as they walked. "Some passages connect to the sacred springs where my people have conducted ceremonies since the time of our ancestors. Others lead to hidden entrances that emerge far from the white man's mining camps." Rose was walking slowly but steadily, cradling her daughter while Patrick supported her arm. The birth seemed to have given her new strength, though Clara knew exhaustion would eventually overcome adrenaline. "Is there a way to reach your grandfather without exposing us to the men who are hunting us?" Clara asked. Running Bear nodded. "There is a ceremony chamber 3 miles from here, where Chief Stonewolf often comes to seek spiritual guidance. I can reach him without revealing your presence until we understand what the spirits intend." They stopped to rest in a natural chamber, where an underground stream provided fresh water and the ceiling opened enough to create a sense of space. Running Bear gathered dried wood from a cache that had been stored there, building a small fire that provided both warmth and better light. "Your daughter was born in the Chamber of New Beginnings," he told Rose, as she nursed the baby. "In our traditions, this is where the spirits reveal the paths that will shape the future. Her birth there carries great significance." Clara wondered what that significance might mean for their immediate survival, but she sensed that pressing for specific answers might not be wise. Instead, she focused on practical concerns. "Do you know if the men from the mining camp are searching for us?" she asked. Running Bear's expression grew grim. "I saw riders and search parties near the mine entrances. They believe you died in the tunnel collapse, but they are ensuring no evidence of your survival remains." The information confirmed Clara's worst fears about their enemy's intentions, but it also suggested a possible advantage. If the conspirators believed them dead, they might not be actively hunting for survivors. "How long before you can contact your grandfather?" Patrick asked. "1 day, perhaps 2, Running Bear replied. "The ceremony chamber requires preparation according to traditional protocols. But you will be safe here while I make the journey." As the young warrior prepared to leave them in the underground sanctuary, Clara realized their survival now depended entirely on the spiritual decisions of a Kiowa chief they had never met, guided by traditions they barely understood in response to circumstances that had never occurred before in tribal memory. But for the first time since fleeing the mining camp, she felt something approaching hope. They had found an ally in the most unexpected place, and Rose's daughter had been born safely despite impossible odds. Whatever came next, they would face it with new life instead of just desperate survival. And that transformation might prove to be the key to their ultimate salvation. After Running Bear departed to seek his grandfather, the three siblings settled into an uneasy routine in their underground sanctuary. The cave provided shelter and fresh water, while Patrick proved surprisingly resourceful at finding edible plants and fungi that grew in the filtered light near underground water sources. But their sanctuary came with profound uncertainty about the future. They were dependent on the goodwill of people they didn't know, guided by spiritual traditions they couldn't fully comprehend, in a situation that apparently had no precedent in Kiowa memory. "What do you think will happen when this chief arrives?" Rose asked, as she tended to her daughter, who seemed remarkably content despite being born in such extraordinary circumstances. Clara had been pondering the same question. "Running Bear seemed to think your daughter's birth was spiritually significant. That might work in our favor, or it might make the violation of sacred ground even more serious." Patrick was less optimistic. "We're white settlers who invaded their most sacred space. Even if the birth changes how they view our presence, they might still decide we need to be removed." Rose looked down at her sleeping daughter, her expression showing a fierce protectiveness that Clara recognized as a fundamental change in her sister's priorities. Whatever happens, this little one deserves a chance at life. That's what matters most now. Clara realized that Rose's transformation from desperate refugee to protective mother represented the most significant change in their circumstances. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were trying to create a future for the next generation. When Running Bear returned the following evening, his expression carried the weight of momentous decisions that would determine all their fates. Chief Stone Wolf entered the sacred chamber with the quiet dignity of a man who had led his people through decades of impossible choices. Despite being nearly 70 years old, he moved with the fluid grace of someone still comfortable in the wilderness, his weathered face marked by lines that spoke of both wisdom and sorrow. The chief was accompanied by 3 other tribal elders, including a medicine woman whose presence immediately commanded Clara's attention. White Dove was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair braided with shells and feathers, and eyes that seemed to see beyond the immediate circumstances to deeper spiritual implications. Running Bear knelt respectfully before his grandfather, speaking rapidly in the Kiowa language while gesturing toward Rose and her newborn daughter. The conversation continued for several minutes, with the elders occasionally asking questions that Running Bear answered with obvious uncertainty. Clara noticed that the baby seemed unusually calm in the presence of the tribal leaders, as if she somehow understood the gravity of the situation being discussed around her. Rose held her daughter protectively, but without the fear Clara had expected, perhaps sensing that these people posed no immediate threat. Finally, Chief Stone Wolf approached Rose directly, his expression grave but not hostile. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected many lives. "Your daughter was born in the Chamber of New Beginnings during my grandson's vision quest," he said, studying the baby with intense curiosity. "In all the generations of our people's memory, no white child has entered the world in this sacred place." Rose met the chief's gaze steadily, showing the same fierce protectiveness Clara had observed since the birth. "I didn't choose where she would be born. We were fleeing for our lives when she decided to arrive." Chief Stonewolf nodded slowly, apparently appreciating Rose's directness. "Running Bear has told us of the danger you face from the men who steal from the earth. These are the same men who have driven our people from traditional hunting grounds and poisoned the streams with their mining." Clara realized the chief was making connections between their plight and his tribe's ongoing struggles with white encroachment. "We're not allied with those men," she said carefully. "They would kill us to protect their crimes." "Yet you are white," observed one of the other elders, his tone carrying decades of bitter experience. "How do we know this is not some elaborate deception?" Before Clara could respond, White Dove stepped forward and knelt beside Rose, studying the baby with the intense focus of someone reading spiritual signs. When she spoke, her words carried an authority that silenced the other voices. "This child carries no deception," the medicine woman announced. "She was born under the protection of the sacred spirits in the chamber where our ancestors received visions of the future. Her presence here is not accident, it is prophecy." White Dove's declaration transformed the entire atmosphere in the chamber. What had begun as a practical discussion about trespassing and tribal security suddenly became a spiritual consultation about prophecy and destiny. "What kind of prophecy?" Running Bear asked, his voice carrying both excitement and apprehension. The medicine woman studied the baby for several more minutes before answering, her expression suggesting she was interpreting signs that others couldn't perceive. "The sacred stories speak of a time when the traditional ways will be challenged by forces that threaten to destroy our people's connection to the earth," White Dove explained. "In that time, new alliances will be necessary for survival. Alliances that cross the boundaries our ancestors never imagined." Chief Stonewolf listened with the careful attention of someone weighing the spiritual guidance against practical political realities. "You believe this child represents such an alliance?" "I believe her birth in the sacred chamber during Running Bear's vision quest, while her family flees the same men who poison our lands, cannot be dismissed as coincidence," White Dove replied. "The spirits rarely speak so clearly." Clara found herself drawn into a conversation that challenged every assumption she'd held about Indian beliefs and white Indian relations. Instead of the simple hostility she'd expected, she was witnessing a complex spiritual and political debate about adaptation and survival. "What would such an alliance require?" she asked, surprising herself by speaking directly to the tribal leaders. Chief Stonewolf studied her with renewed interest. "That depends on what you and your family are willing to offer, and what you're capable of understanding about responsibilities that extend beyond your immediate survival." Patrick stepped forward, apparently recognizing that their fate was being decided in ways that went far beyond simple refuge. "We are willing to learn, and we have information about the mining operations that might be valuable to your people." The chief's expression sharpened. "What kind of information?" Patrick explained about the corporate conspiracy, the falsified production reports, and the systematic theft from original claim holders, many of whom, he now realized, had been Kiowa, who had been forced or tricked into selling their land rights. "The men who are hunting us have stolen not just from white miners, but from your people as well," Patrick concluded. "We have evidence of their crimes, if we can find a way to present it to federal authorities." Chief Stonewolf listened to Patrick's revelations with growing interest, but Clara sensed the tribal leader was evaluating more than just the practical value of their information. He seemed to be testing their understanding of larger principles about justice and responsibility. "You speak of federal authorities," the chief observed, "the same government that has broken every treaty with our people and driven us from lands. we have occupied for generations. Why should we trust their justice? Clara realized they were being asked to grapple with moral complexities that went far beyond their immediate circumstances. Perhaps because the crimes being committed affect everyone: white settlers, tribal peoples, anyone who threatens the criminals' profits. And if we help you reach these federal authorities, what guarantee do we have that justice will be applied equally? That our people's grievances will receive the same attention as white settlers' complaints? The question hung in the air with the weight of historical betrayal and ongoing injustice. Clara understood that Chief Stonewolf wasn't just asking about their specific situation. He was probing whether they could comprehend the broader context of Indian-white relations in the territory. "We can't guarantee federal justice will be equal," Rose said quietly, speaking for the first time since the chief's arrival. "But we can guarantee that if these criminals aren't stopped, they'll continue harming everyone they consider expendable, which includes most women, all Indians, and any white settlers who threaten their profits." White Dove nodded approvingly at Rose's answer. She understands that survival sometimes requires choosing between imperfect allies and certain destruction. Running Bear had been listening to the entire conversation with obvious fascination, and Clara realized the young warrior was receiving an education in tribal leadership that went far beyond traditional training. "Grandfather," he said respectfully, "what if the vision quest has shown us that survival requires new kinds of alliances? What if the spirits are telling us to work with these particular white people because they share our enemies?" Chief Stonewolf studied his grandson with pride and concern. "That is a profound interpretation of your vision quest. Are you prepared to accept the responsibilities such an alliance would require?" What followed challenged every assumption Clara had held about Indian ceremonies and the relationship between spiritual and practical decision-making. Instead of exotic rituals conducted in mysterious ways, she witnessed a carefully structured process that combined spiritual consultation with pragmatic planning. White Dove led a ceremony that involved burning sacred herbs, while the participants shared stories about their backgrounds, their motivations, and their understanding of the challenges they faced. The medicine woman encouraged everyone, including the white siblings, to speak honestly about their fears, their hopes, and their willingness to accept responsibilities beyond their immediate self-interest. "The sacred chambers have heard promises before," White Dove explained as smoke from burning sage filled the air, "but they have also heard lies. The spirits can distinguish between words spoken from the heart and words spoken from convenience." Clara found herself speaking more honestly about her fears and hopes than she had ever done with anyone outside her family. She talked about her dreams for Rose's daughter, her anger at the corruption they had discovered, and her growing understanding that their survival might depend on forming alliances she had never imagined possible. Rose spoke about her transformation from desperate refugee to protective mother, and her realization that her daughter's future would be shaped by the kind of world they created through their choices now. Patrick talked about his guilt over bringing his sisters into danger, and his growing determination to ensure their information about the mining conspiracy would be used to protect other potential victims. Running Bear spoke about his vision quest becoming something far different from what he had expected, and his growing belief that traditional approaches to tribal survival might need to evolve to meet unprecedented challenges. Chief Stonewolf listened to all of these testimonies with the careful attention of someone weighing not just immediate decisions, but long-term consequences for his people's survival. When the ceremony concluded, Chief Stonewolf announced his decision with the formal gravity appropriate to choices that would affect multiple communities. "The sacred spirits have spoken clearly through the circumstances that brought you to our chamber," he declared. Your daughter's birth during Running Bear's vision quest, your shared opposition to men who poison the earth for profit, and your willingness to accept responsibilities beyond your immediate survival. All of these signs point toward alliance rather than expulsion. Clara felt relief flooding through her, but she sensed the chief's decision came with conditions that would fundamentally change their lives. However, Chief Stonewolf continued, such an alliance requires commitments from all parties. You will not simply be protected, you will become part of a larger struggle for justice that extends far beyond your immediate circumstances. The chief outlined the terms of their protection. The tribe would provide safe passage to federal authorities in Denver, where Patrick's evidence could be presented to prosecutors with jurisdiction over territorial crimes. In exchange, the siblings would testify not just about the mining conspiracy, but about the broader pattern of corruption that affected Indian land rights as well as white settlers' claims. More importantly, Chief Stonewolf added, you will help us establish ongoing communication with federal authorities who might be willing to address tribal grievances through legal rather than military means. Clara realized they were being asked to become intermediaries in a complex political situation that involved not just their immediate survival, but the broader question of how different communities could coexist in the rapidly changing territory. And, if we agree to these terms, she asked. Chief Stonewolf smiled for the first time since entering the chamber. Then Running Bear will guide you safely to Denver, where federal marshals can provide protection while you present your evidence. And your daughter will be considered a child of two peoples, protected by both white law and tribal tradition. Rose looked down at her sleeping daughter, understanding that the choice they made would determine not just their immediate fate, but the kind of world her child would grow up in. We accept, she said simply, speaking for all three siblings with the authority of someone who had given birth to the future in the most sacred chamber of an ancient people. The journey from the sacred caves to Denver required a route that would avoid both the mining camp's search parties and the territorial roads where corporate agents might be watching for survivors. Running Bear led them through a network of hidden trails that had been used by his people for generations to move undetected through the mountain wilderness. These paths were created by our ancestors when they needed to travel without being seen by enemy tribes, Running Bear explained as they climbed through a narrow canyon barely wide enough for their horses. Now we use them to avoid the white man's patrols and mining camps. Chief Stonewolf had provided them with strong mountain ponies and supplies for the week-long journey, along with traditional Kiowa clothing that would help disguise their identities if they encountered other travelers. Clara felt strange wearing buckskin and beadwork, but she had to admit the practical clothing was far better suited to wilderness travel than her torn dress. Rose rode with her daughter secured in a traditional cradle board that White Dove had crafted specifically for the journey. The baby seemed remarkably content with the traveling arrangements, sleeping peacefully despite the challenging terrain and constant motion. "How much farther before we reach the main trails?" Patrick asked. Studying the mountain peaks that surrounded them on all sides, Running Bear consulted landmarks that were invisible to the others. 2 days to reach the eastern slopes. From there, 3 days on established trails to Denver. But the dangerous part of our journey begins when we leave the hidden paths. Clara understood his concern. Once they emerged from the protection of Kiowa territory, they would be traveling through areas where corporate agents might be actively searching for evidence of their survival. The mining conspiracy had significant resources and strong motivation to ensure no witnesses reached federal authorities. "What's our cover story if we're questioned?" Clara asked, realizing they needed explanations for their unusual traveling party. "You are my prisoners," Running Bear replied matter-of-factly. "Captives being transported for ransom negotiations. It's a common enough situation that most white travelers won't question it too closely." The plan made Clara uncomfortable, but she recognized its practical value. A Kiowa warrior traveling with white captives would attract less suspicious attention than the same group trying to pass as willing companions. Their first real test came sooner than expected, on their third day of travel, as they approached a water stop used by freight wagons and stagecoaches. Running Bear spotted federal territorial marshals conducting what appeared to be a systematic inspection of all travelers. "Government men," he observed, studying the scene through a spyglass Chief Stonewolf had provided. "They're checking everyone's identification and travel documents." Clara felt her heart sink. They had no proper documentation for their journey, and their story about captive transport might not withstand official scrutiny. "Could we circle around them?" Patrick suggested. Running Bear shook his head. "This is the only reliable water source for 20 miles. Any alternative route would add days to our journey and risk running out of supplies." Rose adjusted the cradle board, holding her daughter, her expression showing the same fierce determination Clara had seen since the birth. "Then we go forward with our story and hope these marshals are more interested in justice than in protecting corporate interests." As they approached the inspection point, Clara noticed that the lead marshal was a tall, weathered man in his 40s whose bearing suggested military experience. His badge identified him as Marshal Daniel Forrester, and his eyes showed the alert intelligence of someone accustomed to detecting deception. "State your business," Marshal Forrester commanded, as Running Bear dismounted and approached with his hands visible and non-threatening. "Transport of captives for ransom negotiation," Running Bear replied in the stilted English he used when dealing with official white authorities. "These people taken from mining camp. Family will pay for return." "Marshal." Forrester studied their group with obvious skepticism. "What mining camp? And who authorized this ransom arrangement?" Clara realized their cover story was about to collapse under official questioning, but before Running Bear could attempt an explanation that might make their situation worse, she made a desperate decision. "Marshal Forrester!" she called out, abandoning their pretense entirely. "My name is Clara Flanagan. We're not captives. We're witnesses to federal crimes who need protection to reach Denver alive." Marshal Forrester's reaction to Clara's announcement was not what any of them had expected. Instead of skepticism or dismissal, his expression showed immediate, sharp interest. "Clara Flanagan," he repeated, consulting a document from his saddlebags. "Sister to Patrick Flanagan, labor coordinator at Silver Bell Mine?" Patrick stepped forward, equally surprised. "You know about us?" "We've been looking for you," Marshal Forrester replied grimly. "Federal prosecutors in Denver have been investigating reports of mining fraud throughout the territory. Your names came up as potential witnesses who disappeared under suspicious circumstances." Clara felt a mixture of relief and confusion. "How did you know we were involved?" Marshal Forrester gestured for them to dismount and gather around, while his deputies maintained watch for other travelers. 3 weeks ago, a former mine supervisor named Henderson contacted federal authorities with allegations about systematic theft from mining operations. She mentioned the Flanagan siblings as honest workers who'd been asking questions about supply discrepancies. Clara remembered Mrs. Henderson, the camp cook, who had been planning to leave for Denver just before their own arrival. Apparently, the woman had been more observant than anyone had realized. Henderson provided enough information to begin an investigation, Marshal Forrester continued. "When we tried to locate you for testimony, we discovered you had vanished from the mining camp under circumstances that suggested foul play." Running Bear had been listening to this conversation with obvious interest. "The white woman speaks truth about crimes against mining claims." "More than just mining claims," Marshal Forrester replied, apparently recognizing that the Kiowa warrior was more than just a guide. The investigation has uncovered a pattern of fraud that extends to land rights, supply contracts, and territorial tax collections. This conspiracy has been stealing from everyone: white settlers, Indian tribes, the federal government. Clara realized their situation had fundamentally changed. Instead of being desperate fugitives trying to convince authorities to listen, they were now key witnesses in an existing federal investigation. "What do you need from us?" she asked. Marshal Forrester's expression grew serious. "Everything you know about the mining operations, the people involved, and especially any documentation you might have preserved. But first, we need to get you safely to Denver. The people behind this conspiracy have already demonstrated they're willing to commit murder to protect their operation." As Marshal Forrester's party prepared to escort them toward Denver, a group of riders appeared on the horizon, 6 men riding hard in their direction with the obvious purpose of intercepting their party. Corporate agents, Marshal Forrester identified grimly, studying the approaching riders through his spyglass. "They must have been watching the water stations for any sign that you survived." Running Bear quickly assessed their tactical situation. "The terrain favors defense if we take position in those rocks, but they have more men and probably better weapons." Clara felt the familiar fear returning as she realized their enemies had tracked them down despite all their precautions. "How did they know we'd be here?" "They didn't," Marshal Forrester replied, checking his rifle and signaling his deputies to prepare for conflict. "But they've been watching every route between the mining territory and Denver. Eventually, they were bound to spot us." Rose tightened her hold on the cradle board, her expression showing the fierce protectiveness that had emerged since her daughter's birth. "What are our options?" "Fight, run, or negotiate," Marshal Forrester answered bluntly. "Fighting favors them numerically. Running risks exposing your baby to gunfire. Negotiating might give us information about the extent of their conspiracy." Patrick stepped forward with unexpected determination. "There's a fourth option. I know these men. They're mine supervisors and security personnel from Silver Bell. They might not know the full extent of what they're involved in." Clara understood her brother's thinking. If the approaching men were simply following orders rather than actively participating in the conspiracy, they might be convinced to stand down when confronted with federal authority. "It's worth trying," she agreed. "But if talking doesn't work..." "Marshal," Forrester nodded grimly, "then we fight, and we make sure your testimony reaches Denver, regardless of what happens to any of us." The 6 corporate agents approached under a flag of truce, led by Foreman Hutchins and 2 men Clara recognized as mine security personnel. Their weapons were visible but not immediately threatening, suggesting they hoped to resolve the situation through intimidation rather than violence. "Marshal Forrester," Hutchins called out as the groups faced each other across 50 yards of open ground. "We're here on behalf of Silver Bell Mining Corporation to escort these fugitives back for questioning about theft from company property." Marshal Forrester's response carried the full authority of federal law. "These people are under federal protection as witnesses in an ongoing investigation. Any attempt to interfere with their transport will be considered obstruction of justice." Clara watched the exchange with growing tension, realizing this confrontation would determine whether they reached Denver alive or disappeared permanently into the corporate conspiracy's efforts to eliminate witnesses. "What investigation?" Hutchins demanded, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Federal investigation into mining fraud, land theft, and conspiracy to defraud the territorial government," Marshal Forrester replied formally. "The Flanagan siblings are key witnesses whose testimony is required by federal prosecutors." One of the security men leaned close to Hutchins, whispering urgently. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she could see the foreman's expression growing, increasingly desperate as he realized the implications of federal involvement. "There's been a misunderstanding," Hutchins tried one final time. These people are confused about what they think they witnessed. If you'll allow us to speak with them privately." "No misunderstanding," Patrick interrupted, stepping forward with surprising courage. "We know about the falsified production reports, the stolen silver, and the systematic theft from original claim holders, and we have documentation to prove it." Hutchins' face went pale as he realized their knowledge was too detailed to dismiss. "Documentation? What documentation?" Clara reached into her saddlebags and withdrew the waterproof case containing the records she had maintained throughout their time at the mining camp. Detailed supply records, production discrepancies, and witness accounts of fraudulent activities. The foreman's expression shifted from desperation to calculation, and Clara realized he was weighing the costs of allowing them to reach Denver versus the risks of attacking a federal marshal and his deputies. Hutchins's decision became clear when he suddenly spurred his horse backward while shouting orders to his men. The corporate agents scattered to flanking positions, clearly intending to surround the federal party and eliminate the witnesses, regardless of the consequences. "Take cover!" Marshal Forrester commanded, diving from his horse as the first shots rang out across the mountain clearing. Running Bear moved with practiced efficiency, helping Rose and the baby reach the shelter of nearby rocks while returning fire with a rifle Chief Stonewolf had provided. Clara was amazed by the young warrior's marksmanship, his shots forced the corporate agents to keep their distance rather than closing for a decisive assault. "We can't hold this position long," Marshal Forrester called out during a brief lull in the gunfire. "They'll work around behind us within minutes." Patrick had taken position with Clara behind a fallen log, both of them armed with pistols that would be effective only at close range. "How far to better cover?" "Quarter mile to those trees," one of the deputies replied, "but we'd be exposed crossing the open ground." Clara realized their situation was becoming hopeless when she heard hoofbeats approaching from multiple directions. Hutchins had apparently called for reinforcements, and their small group would soon be overwhelmed by superior numbers. But as the sound of approaching riders grew louder, Clara noticed something that changed her understanding of their tactical situation. The new arrivals were not wearing the rough mining clothes of corporate agents. They wore the blue uniforms of territorial cavalry. "Federal cavalry," Marshal Forrester called out in obvious relief. Someone must have reported the gunfire. The arrival of military reinforcements transformed the confrontation completely. Faced with overwhelming federal force, Hutchins and his surviving men attempted to flee, but the cavalry had positioned themselves to cut off all escape routes. Within minutes, the corporate agents were in federal custody, and Clara found herself giving preliminary testimony to a cavalry captain who seemed remarkably well informed about the mining conspiracy they had uncovered. "This investigation has been building for months," Captain Morrison explained, as they prepared to continue toward Denver under military escort. "Your testimony may be the final piece we need to bring federal charges against the entire corporate network." As they resumed their journey with both federal marshals and cavalry protection, Clara realized their desperate flight from the mining camp had evolved into something far more significant, a federal case that could reshape the balance of power throughout Colorado Territory. The federal courthouse in Denver was unlike anything Clara had imagined when she first fled Boston's scandal-ridden society. Built of imposing red sandstone with tall windows that caught the morning light, it represented a form of justice that seemed both more powerful and more impartial than anything she had encountered in the corrupt world of corporate mining camps. Federal. Prosecutor James Whitmore was a precise man in his 50s, whose reputation for pursuing territorial corruption cases had made him both respected and feared throughout Colorado. His office walls displayed law books, maps of mining claims, and documentation that suggested the Silverbell case was part of a much larger investigation. "Your testimony corroborates evidence we've been gathering for over a year," Prosecutor Whitmore explained, as Clara, Rose and Patrick reviewed the charges that would be brought against the mining conspiracy. "But your documentation provides the detailed operational proof we need to demonstrate systematic rather than isolated fraud." Clara studied the array of evidence displayed across Whitmore's conference table: financial records, correspondence between corporate officials, witness statements from miners and tribal representatives, and geological surveys that proved the deliberate misrepresentation of ore quality and quantity. "How many people are involved in this conspiracy?" Rose asked, holding her daughter while reviewing documents that revealed the scope of criminal activity. "At least 40 individuals across 6 different mining operations," Whitmore replied, "from local supervisors like Hutchins up to corporate executives in Chicago and New York. The financial theft totals over $200,000, enough to fund territorial infrastructure projects that could benefit thousands of settlers and tribal communities." Patrick leaned forward with obvious interest. "What happens to the workers who weren't involved in the conspiracy? Will they lose their jobs when the companies are prosecuted?" Whitmore's expression suggested he had been anticipating this question. "That depends partly on what kind of alternative arrangements can be established. The federal government is prepared to restructure mining operations under legitimate management, but that requires cooperation from local communities, both white and Indian." Clara realized the prosecutor was hinting at something more complex than simple criminal prosecution. "You want to establish new forms of cooperation between different communities?" "The territorial government is evolving rapidly," Whitmore confirmed. "Colorado will likely achieve statehood within the next decade. When that happens, the relationship between federal authority, local government, and tribal sovereignty will need to be redefined. Your case provides an opportunity to establish precedents for cooperation rather than conflict." Running Bear had remained in Denver throughout the legal proceedings, serving as a liaison between federal authorities and the Kiowa leadership. His presence in the federal courthouse represented an unprecedented level of cooperation between tribal and territorial governments. "My grandfather has agreed to testify about the fraudulent land transactions," Running Bear informed Clara during one of their conversations in the courthouse waiting area. "But Chief Stonewolf wants assurances that tribal testimony will be given equal weight with white settlers' complaints." Clara understood the significance of this concern. Historically, Indian testimony had been dismissed or ignored in territorial courts, even when tribal communities were the primary victims of criminal activity. Prosecutor Whitmore has guaranteed that tribal witnesses will receive full legal protection and that their testimony will be considered equally with all other evidence, she assured Running Bear. The young warrior studied her with the same intense attention he had shown since their first meeting in the sacred caves. "You understand that this cooperation changes everything between our peoples. If the federal government honors its promises, it could create new possibilities for coexistence. If it fails..." Clara recognized the weight of responsibility Running Bear was describing. Their case had evolved from individual survival into a test of whether different communities could work together for mutual benefit. "What does Chief Stonewolf think will happen?" she asked. Running Bear was quiet for a moment before answering. "He believes your daughter's birth in the sacred chamber was a sign that the spirits favor cooperation over conflict. But he also knows that spiritual signs must be supported by human actions to become reality." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Chief Stonewolf himself, accompanied by White Dove and 2 other tribal elders. Their presence in the federal courthouse drew curious stares from other visitors, but Clara noticed that court officials treated the tribal delegation with obvious respect. Federal prosecutors have made commitments about tribal rights that go beyond this individual case, Chief Stone Wolf informed Clara after greeting her with formal courtesy. If these commitments are honored, they could establish legal precedents that protect tribal communities throughout the territory. Clara felt the weight of expectations that extended far beyond her family's immediate circumstances. What kind of precedents? White Dove answered with the spiritual authority that had guided their alliance from the beginning. Recognition that tribal communities have legal standing equal to white settlements, protection for sacred lands from mining and development, and shared authority over territorial resources that affect multiple communities. The trial of the mining conspiracy began 6 weeks after Clara's arrival in Denver, drawing attention from newspapers throughout the territorial and eastern United States. The case represented one of the largest federal prosecutions of corporate fraud in the history of the American West. Clara's testimony occupied an entire day of court proceedings, during which she presented the detailed documentation she had maintained throughout her time at Silver Bell Mine. Her teaching background proved invaluable as she explained complex operational records to a jury of Denver citizens who had little experience with mining operations. These supply manifests show consistent delivery of approximately 60% of requisitioned materials, Clara explained, pointing to evidence charts that Prosecutor Whitmore had prepared from her records. The remaining 40% was invoiced and paid for, but never delivered to the mining camps. Defense attorneys attempted to portray Clara as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge against former employers, but her meticulous documentation made their arguments difficult to sustain. Rose's testimony proved equally compelling, particularly when she described the threats and intimidation that had forced their desperate escape through the mine tunnels. Holding her daughter while recounting their underground ordeal, Rose personalized the human cost of corporate corruption in ways that resonated powerfully with the jury. Patrick's testimony provided the technical details that proved systematic, rather than accidental fraud. His experience as labor coordinator allowed him to explain how production numbers had been deliberately falsified to conceal the theft of processed silver. But the most dramatic testimony came from Chief Stone Wolf, whose presence in the federal courtroom represented a historic precedent for tribal participation in territorial justice. Speaking through a court-appointed interpreter, the chief described how his people had been systematically cheated out of land rights through fraudulent mining claims and deliberately misleading geological surveys. The men who steal silver from the earth also steal land from the people who have protected it for generations, Chief Stone Wolf testified. Their crimes poison both the water and the trust that should exist between different communities. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning verdicts that exceeded even Prosecutor Whitmore's expectations. All major defendants were convicted on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy, fraud, theft of government property, and racketeering. The sentences ranged from 5 years in federal prison for minor participants to 20 years for the corporate executives who had organized the conspiracy. Foreman Hutchins received a 15-year sentence, while Caldwell and the other major supervisors were sentenced to 12 years each. More importantly, from Clara's perspective, the court ordered full restitution of stolen funds, with money returned to both individual victims and affected communities. The restitution order includes compensation for tribal communities whose land rights were fraudulently obtained, Prosecutor Whitmore explained after the sentencing. It also establishes a precedent for federal protection of tribal legal interests in territorial courts. Clara felt a profound sense of vindication as she watched the men who had tried to eliminate her family being led away in federal custody. But she also understood that the trial's conclusion marked the beginning of new challenges about their future in Colorado Territory. What happens now Rose asked, adjusting her daughter in her arms as they left the courthouse for the final time. "Now, you decide what kind of life you want to build," Whitmore replied. "The federal government has offered you permanent protection and citizenship privileges if you choose to remain in Colorado. Your testimony has made you valuable allies in ongoing territorial development." Clara looked at her sister and brother, recognizing that they faced choices that would determine not just their immediate future, but the kind of world Rose's daughter would inherit. 6 months after the trial's conclusion, Clara stood on the porch of a substantial house overlooking a valley that had been transformed by the legal and social changes set in motion by their case. The property belonged to a new type of community that federal authorities were establishing as a model for cooperation between different populations in the Colorado Territory. Clearwater Settlement had been built on land that the federal government had purchased using restitution funds from the mining conspiracy. The community included families from various backgrounds, former miners seeking honest employment, tribal members interested in participating in territorial development, and settlers like the Flanagan siblings who had proven their commitment to justice over personal convenience. Rose emerged from the house, carrying her daughter, now a healthy 8-month-old, whose bright eyes and curious expression suggested the intelligence Clara hoped would serve her well in the complicated world. She was inheriting. "Running Bear is here," Rose announced, gesturing toward a rider approaching along the valley trail. The young Kiowa warrior had become a regular visitor to Clearwater Settlement, serving as a liaison between the community and the tribal council. His role had evolved from reluctant guide to diplomatic representative, helping establish the cooperative relationships that federal authorities hoped would become the model for territorial development. "Chief Stone Wolf has agreed to the mining partnership proposal," Running Bear announced as he dismounted near their porch. "Tribal representatives will have equal authority with federal supervisors in managing the reopened Silverbell operations." Clara felt a surge of satisfaction at this news. The mining camp, where they had nearly lost their lives, was being transformed into a cooperative enterprise that shared profits and decision-making authority between tribal and territorial governments. "What about the sacred caves?" Patrick asked, joining the conversation as he returned from his work as territorial mining inspector, a position that allowed him to ensure other operations maintained the honest practices that federal law now required. "The cave system will remain under tribal protection," Running Bear confirmed, "but federal authorities have agreed to designate it as a territorial heritage site, which provides additional legal protection against future development." Clara realized that their desperate flight through those caves had resulted in protections that would preserve them for future generations, both tribal and territorial. As autumn painted the Colorado mountains in brilliant colors, Clara reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her family from Boston's scandal-ridden society to this new form of community in the American West. The transformation seemed almost impossible to believe. Yet each day's routine proved its reality. Rose had established herself as the settlement's teacher, working with children from various cultural backgrounds to create educational programs that honored different traditions while preparing young people for participation in the rapidly evolving territorial society. Patrick had been appointed as the territorial mining inspector for the entire Leadville region, ensuring that the honest practices established at Silverbell Mine became the standard for all mining operations under federal jurisdiction. Clara herself had become the settlement's record keeper and federal correspondent, maintaining the detailed documentation that had proven so valuable during the conspiracy trial. Her teaching background proved invaluable for creating systems that tracked community development and reported progress to territorial authorities. Most importantly, Rose's daughter, now named Hope Stone Wolf Flanagan, in honor of both her birth Circumstances and the chief who had protected her family had become a symbol of the new possibilities that cooperation could create between different communities. She'll grow up in a world where tribal and territorial governments work together instead of fighting each other, Rose observed as they watched Hope playing with children from multiple cultural backgrounds. Clara nodded, understanding that their daughter represented more than just individual survival. She embodied the future that their alliance had made possible. Running Bear approached them as they sat watching the children play, his expression carrying news that would affect their community's continued development. Federal authorities have approved the statehood application, he announced. Colorado will officially become a state within 2 years, and the Constitution will include provisions for tribal representation in state government. Clara felt a profound sense of accomplishment as she realized the full scope of what their testimony had achieved. What had begun as a desperate escape from corporate corruption had evolved into legal precedents that would shape Colorado's political development for generations. As the sun set behind the mountains that had once represented deadly danger, Clara understood that their journey from desperate refugees to community leaders proved that survival often required not just individual courage, but the willingness to build new forms of cooperation that benefited everyone. Hope's laughter echoed across the valley as she played with her friends, the sound carrying the promise that future generations would inherit a world where different communities could thrive together rather than merely surviving in isolation. The caves where she had been born would remain sacred. The mines would operate honestly, and the territorial government would include voices from all the communities that called Colorado home. It was, Clara reflected, a far better legacy than anyone could have imagined when they first fled the mining camp in desperate fear for their lives. Their story had become part of the larger story of how the American West evolved from a place of conflict and exploitation into a region where justice and cooperation could create opportunities that benefited everyone willing to work for the common good. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.